My name is John Hood. I'm the president of the Pope Foundation, and I'll be moderating our afternoon panels. Our first panel has to do with trade in particular, and more generally about economic policy and how it interrelates with foreign policy. We have a wonderful panel of folks presenting some different points of view on several different issues. We saw during the election cycle of 2016 that there are few issues of greater interest to voters and to conservatives and voters on the center right in particular than issues of trade, and kind of a subset of that is tax reform, the potential for tax reform and how it might affect issues of trade. So we've assembled a panel that we hope is going to be able to explore several aspects of these issues. I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then each of them will give us a few minutes of opening remarks to kind of set the stage for our conversation. Then we'll answer a few more questions and sort of interact with each other. And there will be time towards the end if you would like to ask a question of our panelists. We'll get to that a little bit later. I'm going to start on your left and move right, because you should always move right. I just want you to remember that. It's a subtle point. And we will start, and this will be the order in which they give their opening remarks. Bryan Riley is a senior policy analyst in trade policy at the Heritage Foundation. He brings years of experience in trade and economic issues to his role as the J. Van Andel Senior Analyst at Heritage. His background includes management of grassroots campaigns in support of free trade agreements such as the North American Free Trade Agreement, often known as NAFTA. He joined Heritage in 2010. He grew up in Manhattan, Kansas. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Kansas State, a master's degree in economics from the University of Southern California. He currently resides in Washington, D.C., returning to the nation's capital after several years in Kansas. Kyle Pomerleau, and I think I said that right, Pomerleau, yes, is Director of Federal Projects at the Tax Foundation. In his current position, he leads the tax modeling team at the Tax Foundation, overseeing the center's research and researches and writes on a variety of federal tax issues. His work has been cited in most major media outlets throughout the country. He's an active speaker on the media a lot. He is originally from Maine, and he holds an MPP from the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. He lives in Arlington with his lovely wife, Shu Ting. Brian Reardon joins us representing the American Made Coalition. He is a senior advisor at Venn Strategies. He joined Venn Strategies after serving as a special assistant to President George W. Bush for economic policy, where he was the principal tax aide at the President's National Economic Council. Prior to serving on the White House staff, Mr. Reardon was staff director and chief economist for the Senate Republican Policy Committee. He's also been the lead tax lobbyist with NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Business, and is an aide to Senator Spencer Abraham of Michigan. And our fourth panelist is Art Pope. He is the chairman and CEO of Variety Wholesalers, Inc., a privately held business that owns and operates a general merchandise retail chain, including the Roses and Maxway stores, among others. He is also chairman of the board of the John William Pope Foundation, named after his father. His public service includes 4 terms in the North Carolina House of Representatives, service to former Governor Pat McCrory as state budget director, and service to former Governor Jim Martin as special counsel. Art lives in Raleigh. He's a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and received his law degree from Duke University. He and his wife, Kathy, have a blended family of 3 adult children. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin with Bryan, and each of our panelists will give a few remarks. Bryan, give us a few remarks, and then we'll continue the conversation from there.
All right, thank you, John. And thanks for the opportunity to be here today. One of the things that I like about working, one of the few things I like about working in Washington, D.C. is the opportunity to meet people from all over the country and all over the world. And one of the things that I have learned in D.C. is if you meet somebody from North Carolina, they're almost always, without exception, going to be a nice, friendly person you can sit down and talk to. And being a Midwesterner, I really appreciate that about the people I know from here in North Carolina. Working at the Heritage Foundation for the last 6 years on trade policy and contributing to a publication that we have called the Index of Economic Freedom, where we look at economic freedom in countries around the world. When I go to the office every day, I go in the front door, take the elevator up to the 5th floor. First thing I see when I walk out the elevator is a framed photograph of Caspar Weinberger, advisor to President Reagan for many years. Second thing I see is a framed photograph of Jesse Helms, and then the third thing I see is a framed photograph of Barry Goldwater. So that doesn't consciously register with me every day, but probably maybe subconsciously it gets my conservative juices flowing in the mornings. I think over the last year I've been in North Carolina about 3 times. And the first time I had gone on vacation with my girlfriend to Pensacola, Florida, and for some reason I thought it would be a good idea to drive from Pensacola back to DC. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that after a week of vacation, but if any of you have made that drive, you drive from Pensacola roughly about 2 hours or so to Montgomery, Alabama, and you look out the window. I can't remember if it's to the right or left, it's been too long, and there's a Hyundai factory that makes about 300,000 cars a year. Then you drive about 2 hours farther from Montgomery to West Point, Georgia, a town that many people there call Kiaville, and you look out the window, there's a Kia factory that makes about 300,000 Kias a year. Then you drive about 2 or maybe 3 hours farther and you get to Spartansburg, South Carolina. And you can't see the factory looking out the window, but if you stopped and drove into Spartansburg, you could see my understanding, the world's largest BMW factory here in the United States in South Carolina. And this is as the presidential campaign was going on, and I kept hearing people talk about how we don't make things in the United States anymore. Are you blind? Literally, you just look out the window and you can see evidence of us making things in the United States. And here in North Carolina, if you go back in time, you look at manufacturing output for North Carolina. Imagine a graph, go like this, and the line's going up. And in 1994, actually 93, Congress approves the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Does that line go like this? No, manufacturing output, North Carolina keeps going up and down. It's not a straight line, of course. Then in December 2001, China joins the World Trade Organization. And does manufacturing output in North Carolina, or the United States for that matter, go like this? No, it keeps going up. As a matter of fact, here in North Carolina, from 2002 to 2006, manufacturing output, even after adjusting for inflation, went up about 24%. So the idea that we don't make anything in the United States anymore is something that I don't think, and I know is not reflected in reality. And if you look not just at manufacturing, but look at the overall economy, agricultural producers, pork producers, livestock producers, ranchers, farmers, service providers, those areas of the economy have generally grown even faster. The reason I focus on manufacturing is in DC, they seem to think of manufacturing as much more important than some of those other aspects of the economy. And it is very important. So here in North Carolina, one of the benefits of international trade and commerce is the phenomenal amount of foreign investment by U.S. companies and foreign companies as well that employ people here. About 200,000 jobs from people who work at companies like Daimler Trucks from Germany, GlaxoSmithKline from England, Bridgestone from Japan, Siemens, Volvo from Sweden or China. And about half of those are manufacturing jobs. So that's one of the benefits of open international trade, is not just the ability to import products from other countries. It's not just the ability to export our competitive products to other countries, which North Carolina manufacturers and ranchers are great at. But it's the opportunity to attract foreign investment that creates jobs here. And one of the things that I think is really exciting is the opportunity now to have economic policies that make America a better place to do business. So I'm a big supporter of open trade. I know that if you look at our index of economic freedom, I doubt many people here will be shocked to learn that the countries which have the most economic freedom are more prosperous than those that have the least economic freedom. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the picture at night of the Korean Peninsula, where South Korea is just lit up, and then there's a line, and there's North Korea. There's nothing going on. But the same goes for trade policy as well. The countries that are most open to trade and investment typically are much more prosperous than those that are closed. And when I talk about free trade or fair trade, people define that differently. But as a conservative, I think that just as many people would prefer to be in control of where their kids go to school instead of letting somebody in Washington, D.C. make that decision, or being able to choose which doctor to go to instead of having somebody in Washington, D.C. make that decision. And generally, deciding how to spend and invest your money, that ought to be a decision that you make and not somebody in Washington, D.C. making that decision for you. So that's, in a nutshell, that's the position that Heritage is coming from, and would be glad to really look forward to the comments of the rest of my panelists and the discussion that we'll have coming up. Thank you.
I'm Kyle Pomerleau. I'm Director of Federal Projects at the Tax Foundation. Thanks for having me talk here a little bit about tax policy and tax reform. I think after the election, a lot of people in D.C., especially on the center right, got very excited because they saw politically that things aligned more or less for tax reform. And I was one of the people that thought, we could actually get this done. You know, I think there's been tax reform discussions probably longer than I've been alive at this point, and nothing's really happened. Now, I think after a while, I think reality has set in for a lot of people. People are becoming more pessimistic because, I mean, there is a status quo bias in D.C. that, you know, expect nothing gets done. But I still think tax reform is possible, and it's definitely something that should happen. There's lots of reasons why we need it. I mean, our individual income tax code is definitely a mess, very complicated. We have multiple different credits and deductions for a number of different things. In our business tax code is especially a mess and discourages a lot of economic activity. I mean, you can go down the list of all the problems. One, our corporate income tax discourages investment in the United States. It encourages companies to shift their headquarters out of the United States. It encourages companies to shift their profits out of the United States to avoid taxation. It also encourages companies to finance their projects with debt over equity. And these are all big problems that are well known that should be fixed. And not only could reform fix these distortions, reform could grow the economy as well. It's something that at the Tax Foundation we focus a lot on, is that tax reform, one of the things it can do is increase output, increase wages in the United States, and it's something that we should go for. Now, as for tax reform and what to expect in Washington, well, right now, still a lot of debate, but there's basically two plans out there. Well, really, there's one plan out there and then an outline of a plan out there. The House GOP, they put forth a fundamental tax reform plan that would do a number of things, but I like to think of it in two pieces. It has an individual component, so it would vastly simplify the individual income tax, reduce marginal rates, get rid of a lot of deductions to broaden the base. But on top of that, it has a business component that's much more fundamental, in my opinion. It basically eliminates the corporate income tax, that tax that I outlined, all those distortions, and replaces it with a much more efficient, economically efficient tax, more of a consumption-based tax in the United States. And you think about it, it's something that raises almost as much revenue as the current corporate tax without any of the current problems of the corporate income tax. The plan is roughly revenue neutral, probably a little bit of a tax cut, meaning that spending policy doesn't need to go be discussed alongside of it. It's really just a fundamental transformation of how we raise revenue rather than a discussion of how much we raise revenue. And it's decidedly pro-growth because it fixes a lot of the problems with the tax code. We suspect it would significantly increase the long-run size of GDP, and that means higher wages, higher returns on investment in the United States going forward. On top of the House GOP plan, there's also President Trump has released an outline of a tax plan. Now, where the GOP plan is more of a thought-through, detail-oriented plan, the Trump outline is mainly just, well, here are the tax cuts we would like. For example, big individual income tax cuts, a large corporate tax cut, and then basically saying, well, to fill in the blanks, we'll let Congress decide. So not a lot of detail there, hard to know exactly what the president's looking to do, but you get the sense that at least in a little bit there's some agreement among the House GOP and Trump, but I still think there's a little ways to go there. Just a couple important points about just tax reform and how to think about it and what to consider here. One is that tax reform is hard. So it's easy to, especially if you're thinking of the GOP, it's easy to sell tax cuts. Republicans like tax cuts a lot, but the things that go along with tax reform are not just the cuts, but the base broadeners, the things that you have to give up, the credits and deductions that you may currently be benefiting from that are inefficient. Those are the things that you have to trade away for, and politically, that's a difficult thing. But it's definitely worthwhile. Real fundamental tax reform can fix a lot of problems with the way we raise revenue in the United States. And yes, there'll be political opposition and a lot of disagreement over how to do that, but that's, at the end of the day, that's worth it. You're not going to have something where everyone is going to perfectly agree. There's going to be trade-offs and negotiations, but that's part of the process and something that we, part of the path towards a better system. And the second point here, and I'm sure people have heard this a lot, and it's something that I like to bring up, is that, it's really politically difficult to do this reform thing where you cut rates and broaden the base. People are yelling at me about the base broadeners. I don't want to do that. So why don't we just cut taxes? That's really easy. And, that economic growth from cutting taxes is going to expand the economy, and those tax cuts, they'll pay for themselves. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's just not realistic. When you cut taxes, expect that your revenue is going to decline. So if you are unwilling to broaden the tax base as part of tax reform, expect either one, the deficit is going to increase significantly and debt will increase in the future, or prepare to have a fight over how much spending the government should be doing, what programs that you'd like to cut. So it's never a free lunch out there. There's always hard decisions. So that's a big issue there. So with that, I look forward to the discussion.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'm Bryan Reardon with the American Made Coalition. It's a coalition of manufacturers, large and small, from across the country who are supporting broad, comprehensive, permanent, and game-changing tax reform. The idea that Kyle talked about, where there really are two competing visions right now within the Republican Party in Washington, D.C. And one is, let's just cut taxes, let's cut rates, make it temporary, and go home. The other is the idea that we have an opportunity here, controlling the House, the Senate, and the White House, to do something really transformative, to completely change how we tax American businesses, to reduce dramatically the cost of investing here in the United States, and to have a situation where instead of having a tax code that literally encourages companies to move their headquarters, their profits, their operations overseas, to reverse it, to bring it back. One of my earliest memories of Senator Helms is hearing his voice on the radio. I came and started working in the United States Senate back in 1986. And that was the same year that C-SPAN 2 got started. That's when they started actually putting on television the Senate proceedings. But if you were staff, you didn't have TVs. We couldn't afford TVs. So everybody was given a little clock radio, and you could listen to the Senate proceedings. And one of the challenges, of course, is you're doing your work, you're trying to pay attention to what's going on, was discerning which senator was talking. It didn't make much sense to listen if you couldn't tell who was saying what. And, some of the senators, they stood up. So Ted Kennedy, you knew when he was talking because he had that big Boston accent, and he was always yelling. Phil Graham from Texas was a wonderful man, and he had that, you knew immediately when Phil was on the floor. And then Senator Helms, he was the easiest to identify. He had that beautiful baritone, and even if he didn't have the beautiful baritone, he was always saying something that you wanted to listen to. So the reason I bring that up is because 1986 was also the last year that we really reformed the tax code. That was the big 1986 Tax Reform Act. And in the 30 years since then, we really haven't changed how we tax our businesses, particularly corporations. Back in 86, we cut the rate down to 34. We continued to have what's called a worldwide tax system, so that instead of just looking at business activity here in the United States, we changed it so that we looked at business activity everywhere. If you're a U.S. company, we're going to tax you on your income regardless of where it's made. And we had, we raised the territorial. Oh, and then we had the classic system where we have a double tax on corporations. We still have that. That is, the corporation pays a tax, and then when they kick out a dividend, the shareholders pay a tax. The problem with that is that not only does it drive up the effective tax of investing because you have the two layers, but it creates all sorts of behavioral issues. For example, you hear about all this money that corporations have overseas, right? Well, there's $2.5 trillion overseas because they don't want to repatriate it back to the United States. They don't want to pay that residual tax. So they're keeping it over there rather than bringing it back here and reinvesting. If you take a look at our tax code today, it's almost exactly the same. The rate's gone up a little bit, it's 35%, but we still have a worldwide tax system, and we still have this double tax on corporations that drives up the cost of investing. Meanwhile, everybody else in the world has changed. So back in 86, our 34% rate, that was pretty competitive because the rest of the world, the average rate was in the mid-40s, right? Today, the average is down in the low 20s. So we've stayed still. Everybody else has cut their rates. People have also gone to a territorial system. Back in the 80s, worldwide system was kind of the norm. Today, more and more countries are moving to a territorial system. There's also something else going on, which is all these countries are moving from taxing income through a corporate income tax to taxing consumption through border-adjusted value-added taxes. So the UK is my favorite example. They used to be like us. They had a worldwide system and really high rates, and their companies were leaving London in droves. Well, they got smart. They moved to a territorial system. They cut their rates, and they've systematically reduced their corporate income tax while they've increased their border-adjusted value-added taxes. Net result is now companies leave the U.S. and other places to go to London to reside. They've become much, much more competitive, and it's about time we did something the same. The challenge is what Kevin Brady talks about, which is this Made in America tax. The idea that if you produce something here, you're going to pay a higher tax than something that's produced elsewhere, so that when that product's imported here, they have a tax advantage. They have other advantages, but they also have a tax advantage. When we try to export something to another country, we're going to have a higher tax embedded in that product than the product that we're competing with overseas. That's the challenge. The good news, as Kyle says, is that there really is conformity around a few ideas in DC. One is we got to cut rates. Everybody agrees with that. Two is, and this is the news from the Trump plan that came out a few weeks ago, they've come along and agreed we should move to a territorial system. That's good news too. They also, everybody wants to get rid of the estate tax. And as somebody who works with private companies all the time, I know that that's something that drives people crazy, right? The difference in visions, however, is between what I'm talking about, which is broad, transformative, let's completely redo our tax system, and something that just kind of tinkers around the edges. Let's just cut rates and go home. And the big difference in those is the question of permanence. If you just cut rates, go home, you don't have any offsetting provisions, you're not going to be able to make it permanent. My big bill when I was working for the President Bush back in 2002, 2003, was the 2003 tax cuts. And one of the things we did there was we eliminated the estate tax. Except because it was a straight rate cut bill and because we didn't have offsetting provisions, the Senate rules forced us to sunset the whole thing. So if you passed away in 2010, there was no estate tax, right? If you passed away in 2011, there was an estate tax. The estate tax is still with us. So my goal is not to repeat that mistake. Let's do something that's transformative and permanent so that businesses can make really good decisions. And one of the provisions that's part of the House blueprint that I really hope moves forward is this idea of border adjusting our business taxes. The idea is that if somebody imports something in the United States, they're going to pay the same tax that it's somebody producing something here. There's a lot of concerns about it, and I know we'll discuss it during this panel discussion, but the bottom line is that it levels the playing field. It provides you with the revenues necessary to offset a lot of the rate cuts that are part of the plan. It allows you to enforce the move to territorial, because, for instance, if Apple wants to sell iPhones in the United States, it doesn't matter if they have all their IP housed in Ireland, right? It doesn't matter if they make all their Apple phones in Asia, because when the Apple phones come back here, the border adjustment, they're going to have to pay the same tax as somebody producing phones right here in the United States. So it really does bring the whole plan together. It allows for that permanent tax reform that I think most people are looking for. So that's the idea. I know that it'll be an interesting discussion, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here.
Thank you.
I'm Mark Pope, and the Pope Foundation, as you may have heard at lunch, is a sponsor, and I originally was not going to be a panelist. But in order to have a good debate, they decided to add me because I'm a retailer, and I'm speaking for those who do import goods and represent, I think, the consumers as opposed to the manufacturers who primarily export. I do want to emphasize in this past 6 months on trade and tax policy and the border adjustment tax, it really has been one of the best policy debates with sincere belief, sincere analysis on all sides of it. And we do start from a common point, because one of the reasons we're here is that trade was a major issue both during the general election Republican primary campaign. And there was one candidate in the Republican primary who was a big advocate of free trade. I mean, he said in the debate, plain and simply, I am a free trader. Then he reemphasized another debate, I'm all for free trade. How clear could he be? That candidate was President Donald Trump. A lot of people overlook that. Now, to put it in context, both those quotes, in the first one he says, I'm a free trader, the problem with free trade is you need smart people representing you. And the second quote, I'm all for free trade, but it's got to be fair. When Ford moves its massive plants to Mexico, we get nothing. I want them to stay in Michigan. And that's very similar to some of the comments that Congressman Hudson made at luncheon today. But the core point is, I think it's been long established, and I brought quotes from Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, and David Ricardo on the benefits of free trade, how it mutually benefits everyone. And in fact, one of the first free trade agreements that the United States entered into was the United States Constitution, with the Commerce Clause and free trade between the states. Every time we engage in a transaction within the United States as individuals, we engage free trade with the currency, cash being the means of exchange. Now, I think it's significant, though, because Donald Trump has a business background. He has advisors on various sides of trade issues and on tax policy issues. But when he issued his tax reform guidelines, they were guidelines, it was something I think we can all agree on with center right, and I think even center left, that we do need to simplify our income tax code both at the corporate level and the personal level. It's uncompetitive compared to the rest of the world. And the basic starting point is to lower the marginal rates and then broaden the base. Unfortunately, the House, and so that's where President Trump is. What he did not include is a key component of the House Republican blueprint plan, new blueprint, which is the border adjustment tax we were just hearing discussed lightly. The border adjustment tax is well intended, but is really a very radical change in the way we do taxes in the United States. We've had the income tax for over 100 years since the adoption of the 16th Amendment. And we've been interpreting, the courts have been interpreting it as since 1918 in Supreme Court cases. And income has always been the net income, the profits you make on a transaction, after you're allowed to deduct the cost of the goods you sell if you're a retailer, or your manufacturer, the cost of your raw materials, your components, and even for individuals or in capital, if you buy a piece of land and you buy it for $1,000 and then sell it for $1,200, you don't pay taxes on $1,200. You pay tax on your profit, your gain, your net income, which is $200. The border adjustment tax would radically change that, and that if you are an importer, if you import goods, then you are not allowed to deduct the cost of your goods sold. On the other hand, if you're a manufacturer who exports, you pay no income tax at all. That's a huge shift, and I would argue probably is unconstitutional under the 16th Amendment under court precedents we already have. And the impact on that on retailers is that our taxes will be higher than our profits. So I'll give you a rounded example from my own experience. You can take Walmart. We sell pants and dresses for $10 every day. We sold pants and dresses for $10 in 1986. We still are. There's no inflation in apparel for us. In part because we can source our goods overseas where they can produce most efficiently. So if I can buy in America, I want to do that. But I primarily want to buy for Americans the best value for them. So a $10 pair of pants, the cost of goods would be about $6. Then you have what you call your operating costs, your overhead, SG&A, sales, general administration, is about $3. So you have $1 in profit, pay 35% corporate tax, then you pay 35 cents, and you have an after-tax about 85 cents. Okay, that's good. But under the border adjustment tax, you're no longer allowed to deduct that $6, the cost of the goods you sold. So you have to pay taxes not on $1 of actual profit, but $7, and $7 times a lower 20% rate the House proposed is $1.40. So we're being asked to pay a $1.40 tax on $1 profit, which means we lose money on every item we sell. We can't do that. We'll go out of business. So that's why it will be a massive tax increase through higher prices on the American consumer. And we may hear today, and in the other articles, well, don't worry about it, that the currency is going to revalue, and therefore you buy your goods lower. And there are other estimates that, well, you can take on the big picture, the American family, on average, will receive more in tax savings and thousands of dollars per year versus the higher costs from the border adjustment tax. Those are averages and projections. As you believe the foreign currency argument, that you have to go into currency speculation, take your retirement, put in foreign currency speculation. The averages may be meant in good faith, but there's no such thing as the average American family. That's taking the savings for those of higher income, where we have retirees and those on fixed income. But here's what I do know, that when the tax goes into effect, the border adjustment tax will go into effect, that very first day, January 2018, that's when it goes into effect, I no longer be allowed to deduct the cost of the goods I sell, which means I owe higher tax. I have no choice but to immediately pass on that profit. Now, the argument is made, and Bryan made it about we're just trying to level the playing field. The playing field's already not level. Well, Speaker Ryan gave an example during a press conference back in February about buying a tape recorder. And his quote is, here's what Japan does when they make this tape recorder. When they send it for export, they take the tax off of it, and it comes back to America, and it's not taxed. And it comes through to compete against our good, which was taxed. Theirs was untaxed twice, Ryan said. And it is correct that for domestically, when Japan has a value-added tax, that when you consume a good, the good is made in Japan and consumed in Japan, they assess the they assess the value-added tax. If it's not consumed in Japan, they export to the United States, you're right, there's no value-added tax. But Japan has an income tax, it's 33%. So round figures again, let's say that tape recorder costs $100, expensive tape recorder. If the Japanese company sells it to an American retailer for $60, they have a $20 profit, well, they're going to pay 33% Japanese income tax on that. So they got about $6.07 in tax in Japan. The American retailer has it. Right now, $6, he sells it for $60, he sells it for $100. Has his operating cost, so there's a $10 profit on that. So he pays income tax on that $10 in profit, the same as he would pay it on an American manufactured one. And by the way, it's also Washington, D.C. sales tax. So the transactions are taxed very similar. And that goes to the fundamental guideline for income taxes and taxes in the system. They should be what's called revenue, they should be tax neutral. They should not be used as an industrial policy to favor one sector of the economy over another sector of the economy. And that's the way our tax code is now. It's equally bad for everyone. And it can be improved and should be improved. But the border adjustment tax will treat an importer who sells imports at a disadvantage, a huge disadvantage to those who do domestic goods. Not to mention that exporters will be exempt from all income taxes. And by the way, Japan does not exempt its manufacturers from their income tax on the export goods, only from the value-added tax that's not consumed there. Which goes to another principle of taxation, the benefits principle. That those who benefit from government services should pay for those services. a Boeing or Caterpillar plant that has employees manufacturing goods that are exported, they're receiving the benefit of American law, American defense, the social protective network for their employees, just as a retailer are. But rather than paying for that, they're going to be totally exempted from taxes, whereas the American retailer in my distribution center, which has employees, receives those benefits, we have to pay more than we even make in money and have to pass that cost on to it. So that's just not right. And I meant sincerely what I said at the beginning about the good debate we're having. But there's an old quote attributed to Senator Russell Long, who was a longtime Democrat chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. And it's a variation of this quote that gives a pretty cynical definition of tax reform. He said tax reform is don't tax me, don't tax thee, tax that man behind the tree. Well, the don't tax me are the American manufacturers that export who will be totally exempted from paying income taxes. But the man behind the tree is the American retailers and our customers, and we're not going to stay behind the tree and be taxed.
Okay, so we've laid, our four panelists have laid a number of different ideas and arguments on the table, and I want to explore them a little bit more. In particular, let's stay with taxes and then we'll come back to trade more generally. We've heard the arguments for a fundamental tax reform that includes a border adjustment tax. We've heard some arguments against such a model. And in both cases, the advocates of their respective positions sort of asked an implicit question back to the other side. And I want to make the question more explicit and get some answers to it. So for those who are skeptical of a border adjustment tax as an element of fundamental tax reform, is there an alternative that isn't just cut rates and then they'll expire in years because of the rules of the Senate or and the House? Is there an alternative that would be a permanent tax reform that would be valuable? And then for those who advocated the border adjustment tax as a mechanism, potential mechanism for fundamental tax reform, as Art just alluded to, in most of these discussions, issues of currency come up because, and I think Kyle, you wrote about that, which I read. If we had a change of this sort, there would be an adjustment in the relative value of the dollar versus other currencies. And so importers, like Art was talking about from his perspective, who are faced with profits smaller than their tax bill, because the dollar would appreciate in value, they could actually buy those goods from overseas more. They could get more for the dollar, and that would offset the tax bite to them, and so they wouldn't be harmed by the plan. So for those who advocate the border adjustment tax, what confidence do we have that the dollar would appreciate in value against other currencies and quickly enough and large enough to offset the tax bite on imported goods? So let's, Bryan, you want to comment from the standpoint of more of a skeptic of this?
Well, I would leave it to the tax experts, but in general, it's interesting to me because one of the administration's big complaints is that foreign countries devalue their currencies to get an advantage against us when many of the policies they're pursuing could strengthen the value of the dollar. So that's just something interesting to consider. But I'll really turn it over to the tax experts on this one.
Yeah, I can comment on both of these questions actually. So first, the alternative. So yes, you could find an alternative to this cash flow tax that's being proposed. Oh, and just as a side note, I sort of wince every time someone says the border adjustment tax. There isn't actually a tax called that. It's really, what it really is this cash flow tax where the way corporations are taxed is changed to sort of a consumption basis rather than an income basis. But that's side point. But alternatives, yes, you could find alternatives, but you sort of have to look outside, either outside of the current tax system. So adding something like a value-added tax to the current tax code or a carbon tax to find replacement revenue. Or you could sort of double down on our current income tax system where instead of fixing a lot of the distortions in the tax code, you go to this pure what's called a Haig-Simons income tax, where companies need to write off their investments over more years or more decades, and discouraging more investment. That's an alternative, but you lose the pro-growth element of the plan. So still, there are a bunch of trade-offs here. I tend to tilt towards the destination-based tax simply because it effectively eliminates the corporate tax, and there are a lot of reasons to not like the corporate income tax. Then the second piece is on currencies. I tend to think that the dollar would appreciate rather rapidly and significantly, and in fact, if the GOP plan were put forth, I think it would appreciate more than what the simple theory of what the border adjustment would suggest. So first, the border adjustment, of course, has two impacts on the dollar. It would increase the demand for the U.S. dollar as foreigners want to buy more Boeing airplanes. That's going to have a direct impact on the value of the U.S. dollar because foreigners need the U.S. dollar to buy those Boeing airplanes, and Boeing is able to sell more. So that's one offsetting piece. And then the second is a reduction in the supply of U.S. dollars. That because there's this import tax, foreign companies like Samsung have a slight harder time selling Samsung computers and phones here, a little harder time getting US dollars. So both of those pieces are supposed to be that offset. Then the second piece is, well, the GOP plan overall significantly increases the incentive to invest in the United States, not just for American investors, but for foreign investors as well. They're going to look at the United States as a great place to invest because of the elimination of the corporate income tax. Well, in order to invest in the United States, you have to get your hand on dollars to do it. That's going to by itself increase the demand and shoot up the value of the US dollar. So those pieces, I think, make a good case, at least theoretically, why you should expect that. Okay.
In regards to the, can you hear me?
I don't know if that mic is working live.
In regard to the currency adjustment, I'll defer more to the experts, but a couple quick observations. That is a macroeconomic theory in the aggregate at the national and international level. It's not reality when your retailer negotiating or you have negotiated prices with a vendor and immediately are going to have to increase the cost of that deduction I described earlier. But more importantly, and I will refer to other ones, the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas is one example. Back in 2008, before the current debate, I think it's budget up for debate, where the wire exchange rate so difficult to predict. A four-century quest hasn't found the elusive link between economic fundamentals and currency values. That's especially true if the U.S. dollar serves as international reserve currency. And we do have historical examples to look at. As Great Britain and France adopted and increased their VAT after World War II, you did not see an immediately currency valuation that reflected those changes. And the same for the euro. So it is expected. I do think currency will adjust, but how much and when we don't know. And that is a big risk to the states and major taxes and major like tax code and possibly putting brakes on American economy. Another aspect of this Bryan touched upon is what we're having to pay for is a concept of part of your cash flow approach taxation, allowing us. Okay. Did everyone hear me? I hope. Okay.
You were making lots of good points.
All right, good point. Is on the discount on the destination cash flow point is allowing immediate expensing. So if you build a plant that's going to last for 20 years, you expense it in year one. If you buy a tractor, we have tractors for tractor trailers, tractor cabs that have a useful life for 3 to 5 years, you'd be able to immediately expensing. And we've had variations that past uses short-term stimulus, but with accelerated depreciation, accelerated amortization, that's just not economic reality, and actually that's going too far to the other extreme. I just want to deduct the cost of the goods I've sold and bought in 1 year without having to immediately expense them. And from an accounting point of view, as a business person, if I use that immediate expensing on my books and reported that to my shareholders or publicly traded company, I'll be accused of accounting fraud. It's not economic reality. And you can artificially force, again, using tax code for industrial policy, trying to force investment up front and early rather than looking at the balance between a capital investment and your operating costs and what best serves the American people. Again, the tax code should be as neutral as possible not used for industrial policy to either favor exports or favor massive capital investment versus just controlling your overall costs and your operations.
Yeah, I think Art and Kyle did a very good job of representing their respective positions. I think that what you're seeing here is the plan that was put forward by our friends in the House is a radical plan. It's aggressive. It's something that nobody has really ever considered before. And so it's raising lots of very legitimate concerns. And every time we've been talking with Kyle and I have talked about this for months now, crowds are packed. We've had more people come. There's more attention on this issue than anything else. I hope we get to talk about trade. But let me just talk about a couple of the points that Art raised. One, what's being proposed is, as Kyle says, a cash flow tax. So we're going to take our corporate income tax and we're going to throw it in the trash can. So using an income analysis on the results is not appropriate because it's no longer an income tax, it's a cash flow tax. Expensing is very much a part of that. It's very much like a value-added tax, only it's better. And it's better because we're not double taxing labor. So I talked about how all the other countries in the world, or many of them, China, UK, et cetera, are systematically reducing their corporate income taxes. They're raising their value-added taxes, right? Those are border-adjusted taxes. What we're proposing to do is just leapfrog ahead of that whole process and take them and put them together so that you're ending up with a cash flow tax that can be border-adjusted. It doesn't double tax labor, so you're not picking on workers. The tax falls on capital, not labor. And because we're all conservatives, we don't want to add on more add-on things like an add-on VAT. That's what people don't, on the right side of the spectrum don't want to do, right? You don't want to create another cash source of funding for the federal government. So that's what's being proposed. The border adjustment mechanism is exactly the same, however, as a value-added tax. So for instance, I like to look at the UK because they have a 20% value-added tax. The border adjustment here would be a 20% adjustment. Retailers in the UK, if they import products, have to pay that 20% tax on the value of the imports. That's the way a value-added tax works. And so Walmart, one of his competitors, has 631 stores in the UK. They're expanding in the UK, they're expanding in Europe. They've been expanding for the last 15 years at the same time that all these countries have been increasing their value-added taxes. If all the bad things that are happening or would happen that Art talks about, why is it that all these retailers in these other countries that have border-adjusted taxes at the same size of what we're talking about here are able to build stores, import products, and sell them and expand? All these things that are being raised can't possibly be true because we're seeing that it's not true in other countries. The question about currencies comes up. Again, the mechanism for border adjustment is the same in the cash flow tax as it is for value-added tax. So if the currencies adjust when we see the UK and China and other countries, Australia, raise their value-added tax, and there's a whole bunch of academic literature being done over the last year or so, ever since this issue became hot, saying exactly that. What they find is that prices adjust. And what they also find, according to our friend Alan Viard, according to folks at the Peterson Institution, is when you do a cash flow tax, which is what the House has proposed, the adjustment comes in the form of dollar appreciation, not in the form of higher prices for consumers. So I think there's a couple things here. One, this is not an experiment in the sense that nobody has ever done it. 160 countries around the globe have value-added taxes that are border adjusted. Two, this is a new thing in the sense that we're doing it better. We're not going to double tax labor. We're not going to add on a value-added tax on top of all the other taxes that we have. So that it's going to be a much more efficient way to do it. And Art and I were chatting before we got started here, and the one thing we agree on is that if American workers want to continue to compete with all these other countries that are moving into the free market and have wages significantly lower than what we're paying our guys, we need to have more capital. And the way to get more capital is to drive down the cost of investing. And that means territorial, low rates, and permanent. And as your question suggested, how do you get there if you don't have something like the border adjustment? Nobody else has proposed a really good plan B. There's nothing politically out there, certainly not something that incorporates all the good things that the border adjustment offers to this plan. And until they do, we're going to continue to be talking about it. I think we're going to be debating the border adjustment.
All right, I think both Kyle and Art raised their hand to say something in response to what somebody else was saying.
I think you should let Larry.
All right.
Go ahead.
I was asked a direct question, which I'm happy to answer. Why is Walmart expanding in the United Kingdom and other countries? Because they can pass on the cost of higher prices to their customers. It costs far more to buy the same goods, whether it's a pair of pants. You're not going to find a $10 pair of pants or £10 pair of pants in London or Leeds or anywhere else in the United Kingdom. Historically, conservatives have been against the value-added tax because it's called a hidden tax. It's what fuels the welfare state, the social welfare state in Europe. And it keeps increasing every single time. Over time, it keeps increasing. It originally started off at 15 or 7, 8, 10, 15% in the United Kingdom and France and the other countries it's increased. So Walmart won't go out of business. I won't go out of business. Some small retailers who can't pass on the cost will go out of business. But we'll be okay because we can pass on the cost to the customer. But the government will be better funded, and the individual will be worse off, a lower quality of life because of the higher cost of living, because of the higher prices. And what's interesting, the cash flow tax, I'm fine using the word cash flow tax, that concept's been around for a while. In fact, one of the earlier proponents was put forward by the Center for American Progress. A modern corporate tax, December 2010 by Alan J. Albrecht at the University of California, Berkeley. In case you don't know, the Center for American Progress is more associated with the progressive left and the Obama administration than this with conservative proposals. And in here they have the immediate expensing and other elements of it. And one of their complaints was they didn't like international tax competition. They wanted a more uniform tax system. They wanted a more assured source of income for the United States in order to grow government and fund their programs. And that is where we're going with the House proposal. We're going to become more like the social welfare states with a value-added tax, and the quality of life, Americans will be worse off than they are under the current income tax system, the current system of trade.
All right, if you've got a quick point, let's make it, and then let's get into one trade question, and then we might want to go to the audience.
Yeah, just a quick response to this idea of industrial policy. I agree that industrial policy is bad. I just don't agree that expensing or the border adjustment are industrial policy. Expensing, like we've discussed, is an allowing immediate deduction for investment the first year. That's the neutral treatment. Current law, where assets have to be written off over a number of years, that is non-neutral. That's the aspect of the corporate tax that discourages additional investment. So expensing is fixing a problem with the corporate tax, and a border adjustment is trade neutral. You look across the entire world, all of the border adjustments, all of the economic literature will tell you that the border adjustment is trade neutral. It's basically switching a tax system from an origin-based tax where you're taxing goods and services based on where they're coming from, to a system where you're taxing goods and services where they are ending up. So this is a principle of consumption-based taxation. It's something that the retail sales tax of North Carolina adheres to the destination-based system. It has a border adjustment. North Carolina does not charge a sales tax on a good that's sold in California. So it's, again, so I disagree that it's either of those things are industrial policy.
Okay, let me throw out a sort of a macro trade question for anybody to answer, and it's kind of implied in a lot of the discussion about this issue that we've already heard. As y'all know, the United States of America runs a trade deficit and has for a number of years with most countries in the world. So we have a net trade deficit per se, we have a trade deficit with most countries. Should it be an explicit goal of the federal government, President, the Congress, to turn those trade deficits into trade surpluses with the rest of the world? And if that's a good goal, how would you go about accomplishing it? Bryan?
Well, we know how to turn a trade deficit into a trade surplus. We did it during the Great Depression, and the last big reduction in trade deficits was our Great Recession, where we were poor, couldn't afford to buy as much domestically, couldn't afford to import as much. A quick point about the trade deficit. So if Kyle here decides to buy a new tie, and let's say it's $30 and you import it from China, you have just added $30 to our trade deficit with China. Is everybody with me so far? John, how much do you owe people in China? Because Kyle, I won't put you on a spot. How much does Bryan owe people in China because we now have a $30 trade deficit with China? Zero. Nothing. The term trade deficit is extremely misleading. Now, what China is going to do with those dollars is they're going to buy U.S. exports, they're going to buy North Carolina pork, or they're going to invest in our economy. A lot of those dollars just historically come to buy U.S. Treasury bonds to finance government deficit spending. So we can complain all we want about China, but as long as the federal government wants to essentially export Treasury bonds to China instead of privately made U.S. products, we're going to have a trade deficit. So to me, the trade deficit in and of itself is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It depends on the underlying economic factors. I'd much rather look at policies that designed to make us more competitive than policies designed to reduce the trade deficit. For example, I think one of the big policy successes for the Trump administration has been approving the Keystone XL pipeline, which has been debated, argued for years. That is something that's going to increase imports of oil from Canada to the United States, and that's something that's going to make the United States more competitive. So I think it's much more, John, to focus on competitiveness, and is it good for freedom and economic growth than this number, trade deficit, which doesn't in and of itself tell you anything about the U.S. economy.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Trade is basically this machine that we use to transform our airplanes into laptop computers from South Korea. I mean, it's not, having a trade deficit is not a big deal. I mean, one thing it does reflect, like you mentioned, is a large capital inflow into the United States. And I mentioned this a little bit in discussion of the currency thing, and it's kind of related, but our trade deficit is driven by the fact that countries are selling us lots of stuff in order to get our capital assets, whether it's treasury bonds or dollars or equities. United States is a really good place to invest compared to a lot of places, and that's one of the drivers of the trade deficit. And it's interesting to me, and it's just a slight side note, that I think there's a contradiction in Trump's economics when he talks about this stuff. He would like to, one, reduce the trade deficit, but also at the same time would love to encourage new investment in the United States from foreigners. Well, you can't do those at the same time, because if you encourage more investment in the United States from foreigners, you are going to drive up the trade deficit.
Accounting.
Yes.
Bryan.
Yeah, sure. No, I think it's an excellent question. And I think from my perspective, trade happens. People instinctively trade, and one of the challenges we have is that, with our tax policies and some of our other policies, we throw up barriers to trade. And so my goal has always been to reduce those barriers as much as possible. I think the House Blueprint is a big step in that direction by reducing the cost of investing here. It creates a dynamic where we can increase our trade with other countries. I do want to address one issue that Art mentioned, which is sort of this idea of the Made in America tax that Kevin Brady talks about, and I think it's relevant to this question. So one of the examples that I use for the challenge that we have is, Ford wants to sell Focuses in the UK, right? They first have to pay one of the world's highest corporate taxes here, which is the problem, right? They then have to pay that 20% border adjusted tax. They also have to pay a 10% tariff that the EU imposes on car imports. And then, so if you add all that up, you're almost at about 60% of the value of the Focus. Now, Ford makes cars over in the UK as well. If they want to export one of those cars here, they don't pay the VAT because it's border adjusted, so they don't pay that. They do have to pay the UK corporate tax, but as we said, the UK has been systematically reducing that. Again, that's the problem there. Corporate tax is low, ours is really high. We have a 2.5% tariff here on cars imported in the United States. So the net result is the total tax on the car imported here is about 20%. So that's not the balance that we're looking for. And I think the goal of any policy, both trade and tax, would be to balance that out, so that we can compete on a level playing field. My preference would be that we get our taxes on businesses down enough that we're encouraging investment here. We drive down the cost of capital here in the United States so that you have an increased chance that, you know, when Art needs to source something 5 years from now, it's going to be made here. When Ford wants to build Focuses and sell them here, they can make them here and they can sell them in the UK.
I agree in part with Bryan to an extent on that balancing things out. As I said at the beginning of my remarks, Congressman Hudson said, as candidate now President Trump said during the debates, trade agreements are not the same as free trade. There are many inequities in the current trade agreements with many of our trading partners, including the example Bryan just gave. I was going to use the example of South Korea, where American products are still penalized and taxed. However, the end goal in and of itself is not to balance things out. The end goal is for the American citizen, the American family, to be better off. And I'm sorry that the United Kingdom taxpayers are being penalized by their government and have to pay more taxes on buying an American car, whereas but I'm not sorry that Americans are getting a better deal and can afford to buy a UK car or a Korean car because we don't have the punitive taxes to fund the American government. I mean, one of the last trade agreements we entered into was South Korea, and that's been cited by members of the Trump administration. I saw Senator Jeff Sessions during the campaign speak on this. He said that was a terrible deal because indeed before the South Korean trade agreement went into effect, our trade deficit was $16.6 billion. Well, that trade deficit has doubled to $27.7 billion. So are we worse off? No. We are still exporting to South Korea. We could actually use better terms on exporting our cars. They still prohibit exportation of rice, but we're still selling to Korea, and Korea's investing in building cars in the United States. They're employing Americans. The assumption is not the economic argument or the accounting argument, how you measure balance of payments on an international level. The assumption is that a trade deficit means that you're losing jobs. And it is easy to see a job loss when a textile plant or furniture plant is closed. That's what, again, Congressman Hudson said. But when I can import a pair of pants for $6, pay my overhead and sell them for $10, where to pay, you can't find them in America. If I could find them from America and sell them for $20, well, the American family has $10 less money to spend on a single pair of pants. That $10 being spent on other items elsewhere in the economy, creating jobs. So overall, leave it up to the American citizen, the American family, all the decisions we make in a free society, what we want to buy, restrictions on trade, border adjustment tax, tariff taxes. They are all taxing the American citizen and denying them the complete free choice at the minimum cost to make their own decisions for themselves, how best to provide for themselves and their families.
All right, we have a few minutes left in this panel, and we'd like to take some questions from the audience if we can, so go ahead.
Microphone
my name is Good, and I have to say, I fundamentally wholeheartedly disagree with the position. Here's number one, okay? I grew up in China, and during the Chinese economic boom, because China goes to very good trade routes, okay? China's successful managing has attracting investment, large sums, and managing to keep huge trade supplies, okay? If you go to American small towns, all of the manufacturing colors. It is the next to something. No matter what is in the name, the police people, our new generation don't know how to make clothes, they don't know how weapons made, they don't know how anything is. And I think this is a national security issue. Because anytime we have any conflict in a foreign country, they don't have to shoot one bullet. All they need to do is check out the ship. A lot of time people will call you, we have free trade. We do not have free trade in America. We have the far worse trade deal anything, any country speaking the not in ourselves. That's why we have this 500 billion trade deal with China. And China would love someone to have this kind of deal because they continually get out of the wealth. That's the largest wealth transfer from America have been accumulated for generations to foreigners. Let's take example. You buy $30 from China, but you have to pay $60 from America. It looks like the consumer overspend $30 to buy American. But but we forgot each individual. We are American consumer. We also have other identity. We are taxpayer. We are citizens. We are freedom, and we are also a community. So if you allow capital flow freely you allow the product to flow free, which we are not using free because, but you don't allow people to flow free, then people will get stuck in some places. And that's the reason the free trader will never talk about American consumer, also American taxpayer. The taxpayer will go to pay into our government. So if the people, they lost job, they don't go to China to get their unemployment benefit. They go to their local government unemployment benefit. So you let the capital flow free, you don't let people flow free. So another thing is about
Well, let's get to the answer to that question, just so it would be fair to other people. Bryan, go ahead.
Well, I appreciate your passion and the clearness of your question. I doubt anything I say will change your mind, but there are certainly important points, and you represent a view that many people hold. My understanding is that the reason China has grown so much, and the reason so many people in China and that part of the world have been lifted out of poverty, is because they made strides towards opening up their economy. They cut their average tariff rates on imports from 30% down to 3 or 4%. They started moving towards property rights and allowing people to keep what they've produced. Have they gone far enough in that direction? Absolutely not. I'll just fall back on our index of economic freedom, which without getting into a bunch of economics, which I think is pretty clear that the regions and the governments that give people the most freedom are more prosperous than those that try and dictate who they can do business with. The national security arguments that you make are separate from the economic arguments, and I think are also very important. You know, Senator Helms, one of the policies he worked on was trying to get rid of something called the Jones Act. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the Jones Act. So the Jones Act says that if you want to ship something from one point in the United States to another on a ship, it has to be a U.S.-built ship. If you want to fly an airplane, you can use Airbus or Embraer or Boeing. If you want to put it on a truck, you can do Volvo or Mack or whatever. And those are industries that are very competitive. But because Americans have been required to use the U.S.-built ships that are 3 or 4 times more expensive than ships available around the world, it's often more affordable for Americans to get products from abroad. For example, North Carolina agricultural producers, at times, they will bring grain in from Brazil 4,000 miles away instead of bringing it from the Midwest, because if they brought it from the Midwest, they'd have to use these U.S.-built ships. So the whole purpose for the Jones Act is allegedly to protect our defense and security base. But today, if an American shipyard wants to build a cruise liner or a tanker or a bulk cargo vehicle, what they have to do, and what they do, is they call somebody in Europe or they call somebody in South Carolina, they buy the plans because we don't have the expertise to make them anymore. They import the parts and they put it together in the United States. So I think the competing is something, it's clear that we're better off when you go buy a car because we have competition worldwide, not just for consumers, but because it's made car makers be better. The last thing I want to see, for example, unless we need to make every drop of steel in the United States for national security reasons, I don't think we should make U.S. car makers pay more for steel. I don't think we should make U.S. Oreo manufacturers pay more for imported sugar, because you do that, they just move. Oreo cookies will start getting made in Mexico. So there are arguments on both sides of this, and the points you make are very important, but I really believe that moving in the direction of more trade and engaging China in a proactive way to try to, they clearly have not continued to progress as we would hope to a market-oriented economy, and that's something that is going to be an issue going forward. The last little point I will make, that in general, is when people do business with each other, they're less likely to go to war, because you don't typically want to shoot your customers or your suppliers. You asked a lot of questions. I gave a lot of answers. And so,
Bryan, in your answer, you were talking about, in response to this policy, people wanting to source the raw materials or the pieces of the boat in Europe or South Carolina. I don't know if you meant to say South
Korea.
Korea, but if you were suggesting that South Carolina is a foreign country, you would be correct from our perspective. From North Carolina, they're pretty weird.
Thank you for catching that.
If we have one more quick question before we go, yes, sir, go ahead.
I'm from South Carolina, by the way.
Welcome to the country.
My question is,
Enjoy your stay.
in the tax business, just like Art nailed it, he's going to raise the price of pants when the government taxes more, or he goes out of business, one of the two. Why, if we're thinking about fundamentally transforming the tax system, why are we not looking at the fair tax, where it's just all consumption-based only, we get rid of all income tax and get rid of the IRS?
That's an easy question to answer in the minute we have.
Yeah, exactly. So a couple thoughts. One, the fair tax is a sales tax. So I think all the concerns that Art raised about a border adjustment would also apply there if you're speaking from the consumer's point of view. I think a point that's been lost in this conversation is that the overall plan that the House has put forward is a tax cut. It's a $2.5 trillion tax reduction on both businesses and families. For different industries, the border adjustment may have an impact if Art is correct and currencies don't adjust. If they adjust, there's no impact. If they don't adjust, then Goldman Sachs broke it down and they said of 39 different industries in the United States, 33 would see a tax cut, and therefore the pressure on prices would go down. 6 would see a tax increase and the pressure on prices would go up. The worst industry was apparel, and in order to offset the increased cost of the tax, if currencies don't adjust, which I disagree with, you would have to raise prices on average in apparel by 7 percentage points. So the idea that consumers, families are going to be worse off on this is just not true. I think Kyle's done numbers that show that when you take the whole tax cut into account, including the family tax relief that's in the plan, including economic growth, including the increased wages because people have both 1.7 million more jobs and higher wages, 8 percentage point higher wages, families have $4,600 a year more to spend than they would under the current situation. So the idea is not that we're going to make families worse off. The question is, how are we going to structure our tax code? The fair tax is a perfect question. Do we want a pure sales tax like the fair tax? Do we want something that's more of a consumption-based tax like this cash flow tax that we're talking about? Or do we want to continue to tax income, which effectively puts the pressure on producers both on capital and labor? I think the cash flow tax is the perfect middle between those two extremes.
One of the keys you just pointed out about the fair tax is abolishing the income tax, and it really takes a constitutional amendment. I know. If you were to start from scratch and wanted the consumption tax type approach, I think a fair tax or national sales tax is the way to go. There are differences between a retail sales tax at the state level or the fair tax. That's, I think, you acknowledge some with the cash flow value added tax. But here, among all the other dangers, and I respectfully disagree with the numbers, I know the math on what I'd have to charge, increase the price to my customers, more like 20% to stay in business when I'm going to not allow the tax deduct the cost of goods sold. But part of the problem is we do have an income tax system, again, authorized by the 16th Amendment, interpreted by the Supreme Court to be after you deduct the cost of your goods sold or your cost of manufacturing or the cost of the capital goods. The proponents of the consumption tax, they don't want to debate a value-added tax. They know they're not going to get a constitutional amendment to abolish to change the income tax, so they're trying to draft a consumption value-added tax on top of our income tax. The danger is that when the progressive left, this is a nonpartisan group, so I'll refer to the progressive left rather than any political party, when they get back in power, they can raise that 20% rate that's embedded in the border adjustment tax and the House blueprint and keep that hidden tax as well as raise the other taxes. And indeed, we're going to have a balanced out where the American citizens will be paying as high taxes as the European citizens, which is not what we want, and not going to grow the economy in the long term.
So we could extend this conversation another half an hour, and that would be all that would be required to agree, I think. But I'm afraid we can't. We have to end it there and say thank you to our panel. And we will reconvene in just a few minutes for our next panel on security and terrorism. Thank you very much.
I appreciate that.